In modern Israel today, as well as in Jewish communities all over the world, there are institutions called yeshivot. A yeshiva is a place where you sit and study. You may have seen this in movies like Yentl or Fiddler on the Roof, where the Jewish community comes together, men, and they sit and study and they debate and they review and they memorize these texts, gigantic volumes of text, until they have it down word for word, are able to repeat it at will, upon demand, word for word. In Israel today, there is a movement called the Datiim, the ultra-Orthodox, those who wear the black clothing and the large hats and the like. And these guys will go to these yeshivot, to their own yeshiva. They will sit and they will study, they will read, they will review, they will quote, they will memorize, they will quiz one another, they will debate with one another, quoting authority after authority until an issue to their satisfaction has been resolved. I went to school with these kinds of people as my professors. When I got to Hebrew Union College in 1986, I was studying with people like Werner Weinberg, who was a Jew from Germany, was able to escape the Holocaust, with Yitzhak Yerushalmi, who was a Jewish professor of mine from Turkey, who was fluent in about 6 or 8 or 9 languages. He did his PhD at the Sorbonne in French in France, but he did his PhD in Arabic. He had these guys, Eugene Mahali, my Midrash professor, memorized tons and tons of these ancient, traditional, authoritative rabbinic texts and had them at their disposal. I sat in the back of the room near these guys so I could hear them talking to one another when a visiting lecturer would come from Yale or Harvard, somewhere like that. And you could hear these guys from the old world who had memorized this stuff as children, had learned this stuff from an early age. And when the lecturer would make a point or make a statement that they disagreed with, you could hear them mumbling those texts, repeating those texts under their breath, sometimes comparing texts, sharing text with one another, but always orally, always constantly quoting from memory. My doctor father, as I mentioned earlier, was Dr. Ben-Zion Wacholder. He was in the top 10 or 20 authorities in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the entire world, and just an amazing man. He lost his entire family in the Blitzkrieg when the Gestapo reached Warsaw, Poland, where his family lived. The only reason that he survived was that he had spent the night with some friends out in the country. And he taught me and coached me through the remaining part of my doctoral work and through all of my doctoral dissertation on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, Dr. Wacholder it taught me a number of really important things. One thing that he said was, Wave, if you ever want to understand the words of Jesus, you have to understand him as a first century, a Second Temple period sage. You have to read the writings of the New Testament, he would say, like you would read an intertestamental, a between the testaments document from sectarian Judaism. Another thing that he told me in answer to a question one time, I said, Dr. Wacholder, when you were a kid growing up and you were dropped off and you began memorizing all of these materials, volumes and volumes of materials, and memorizing them, knowing them by heart, having them at easy access at a moment's notice, quote, just at a will. Were you looked at as being some kind of like a Bible nerd, or as being a geek, or as some, bizarre aberration of society? And he said, oh, no, Wade. He said, if you couldn't memorize this stuff, you were looked at as being mentally challenged. I went, okay, sign me up, because, you know, that's kind of where I live and move and have my being. But Dr. Wacholder was, Dr. Weinberg, Dr. Yerushalmi, Dr. Mahali, these guys were from a world that almost doesn't exist anymore. Only in certain pockets and places. I mentioned the Datiim in Israel, and in certain places in the United States, like LA and Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. Um, there are only pockets of these people still left. And yet these guys in the 20th and 21st centuries were preserving a form of knowledge, an ability to memorize, like the brain was a finely honed muscle. That is almost unknown, with our post-it notes and with our, you know, cell phone reminders going off constantly. We are moving further and further away from this world, and yet this is the very world that was being described by Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, that said that all of this vast material, this oral Torah, this Torah Sheba'al Peh, was being passed on by word of mouth, by an authoritative teacher proclaiming it, and then disciples memorizing, studying, repeating until the material was learned by heart.